Okay, well, welcome to our Kennan Institute discussion, and the title is Causes and Consequences of Russia's Year of War in Ukraine. I'm Jill Doherty. I'm a global fellow here at the Kennan Institute, and I want to thank everyone for joining us. We have people here physically in the audience and virtually at home, hundreds of them. It's a very good turnout. And I also want to thank the Wilson Center's Global Europe program for co-sponsoring today's conversation. I encourage everyone to stay up to date on the latest Kennan Institute events and publications by visiting our website and subscribing to our two blogs, Focus Ukraine and Russia File, as well as our podcast, Kennan X, which is the one that I do, and the Russia File. In the latest episode of the Kennan X podcast, I hosted a long-form interview with Ambassador Sullivan, and you can find that on our site. And also, please visit our Hindsight Upfront Ukraine collection on the Wilson website for the latest news and analysis focused on Ukraine. Now, housekeeping. We've got a lot of time. We have an hour and a half, which is great, so we can really get into this discussion. And if you want to ask a question during the course of this conversation, there are several ways you can do it. You can submit via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter at Kennan Institute, or on our Facebook page at any time. So please include your name and affiliation when you're sending questions. I'll begin by briefly introducing each of our speakers, and then we're going to jump right into a discussion. Our speakers will have 10 or 15 minutes to kind of set the scene here. Then we'll have a few more questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So let us begin with Ambassador John Sullivan. Ambassador Sullivan was our U.S. ambassador to Russia from December 2019 to October 2022, 3 long and pretty challenging years. Prior to his post in Moscow, Ambassador Sullivan served for almost 3 years as Deputy Secretary of State, and he's currently a partner in Mayor Brown's Washington, D.C. and New York offices, co-leading the firm's national security practice. He's also a colleague, a distinguished fellow at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. We're also joined by Olena Lennon. Dr. Lennon is an Eastern Ukrainian native from Donetsk. She's an adjunct professor of political science and national security at the University of New Haven, where she teaches courses on U.S. foreign and defense policy, and international relations. Dr. Lennon was formerly a Fulbright Scholar and most recently a Title VIII Scholar at Woodrow Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. And last but not least, our colleague also, Will Pomeranz. Dr. Pomeranz is director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute, and he's an expert guide to the complexities of political and economic developments in Russia, particularly, and I think this is unique and very interesting, through the prism of law. He has an extensive hands-on experience in international Russian jurisprudence on a wide range of legal issues, from development of the Russian Constitution to human rights law to foreign investment and sanctions. And he's also, I will plug your book because it's really excellent, Law and the Russian State, Russia's Legal Evolution from Peter the Great to Vladimir Putin. So let's start with our discussion. And again, reminder, questions can come in through email, kennan@wilsoncenter.org, Twitter @Kennan Institute, or Facebook. And your name and rank and serial number, your identification when you're asking those questions, okay? Boy, you know, this is a broad subject, and I thought about this. I can literally tell you at 3:30 a.m., I was thinking, how do we kind of encapsulate this? Because I think all of us, looking back, 1 year that this the conflict has been going on for 9 years, but this invasion and then this chapter sad chapter in the conflict has been going on for a year, and I don't think anyone, including Vladimir Putin, expected that this would be going on for a year. And it raises all sorts of questions. But if you look at this week, and I'm really glad this is the week that we will be together, just look at what happened in the last couple of days. We had Biden streaking into Kyiv. We had Biden's speech in Warsaw, Poland. We have Putin's address to the Federal Assembly and the announcement about suspending its participation in New START. And then we have the actual date of the invasion, the 24th of February, a year ago. So a lot to kind of pull together. But Ambassador Sullivan, I know you were very carefully reading and listening to that speech by Vladimir Putin yesterday, which really does seem to sum it up. So could you please tell us, what do you draw from that? And is it a turning point, or where are we with Mr. Putin?
Well, thank you, Jill. It's a pleasure to be here, as always, with you talking about Russia issues, and to be here at the Wilson Center on this anniversary week of the special military operation. A year ago, I was in my office at Embassy Moscow, and we were digesting the news that Russia had just digested the two so-called People's Republics, Donetsk and Luhansk, the day before on February 21st, which was the lead into the special military operation, which began on the 24th. At the time, and I said this before February 24th, 2022, that I was certain that the Russians were going to reinvade on a large scale Ukraine. But what I wasn't certain of was how the Ukrainians would resist, how President Zelensky, how he could survive the onslaught from the Russian military. And it was certainly my impression from my engagement with Russian leaders in the months before the war that they were supremely confident, bordering on arrogant, on their ability to handle the situation in Ukraine. 1 year later, it's an entirely different situation for President Putin, and I think I've, as Jill mentioned, I've obsessed about his remarks yesterday, which of course there was President Biden's remarks shortly thereafter. I was thinking about historical comparisons, and maybe it's Gettysburg. Biden speaks for 21 minutes, more Abe Lincoln. Putin speaks for almost 2 hours, more Senator Everett. But President Biden covered the basis for what has been U.S. foreign policy with respect to Russia, and the symbolism of his trip to Kyiv, being in Warsaw in front of that enthusiastic audience of Poles and others, including Moldovans, an important point. It was a great reaffirmation of U.S. policy. Putin's speech, on the other hand, was very interesting, I thought. He begins and ends with the following. It's a very, his words, difficult time for our country, which is how he begins. He concludes with a difficult path, that they're on. He then lays out both domestic policy and foreign policy and security policy issues that are all meant to address the situation that Russia now finds itself in the midst of its special military operation. And Putin himself says right at the front what the special military operation is about. He says, a year ago, for the sake of protecting people in our historic lands, quote, our historic lands, he launched the special military operation. I mean, that encapsulates it, right? Mm-hmm. Ukraine isn't a country. Ukraine is ours. Ukraine is part of the Triune Rus. This is our historic, my patrimony I got from the Tsars, from Peter the Great, from Catherine the Great. And by God, I'm on a mission to regather the Russian people, the Russian lands. And that's the point of the special military operation. It was launched on the cheap, far fewer troops than one would have expected to subjugate a country of 44 million people. By historical comparison, the Nazi Germany had, almost 1.5 million troops engaged when they launched their war in 1940 against the Low Countries and France being roughly the size of Ukraine. Putin had fewer than 200,000 troops engaged in the special military operation. Supported by the FSB, they thought they had prepared the battlefield well, that they didn't need massive military formations, because they thought, just as Hitler thought at the start of Operation Barbarossa, that the Soviet Union was a rickety shack and all they needed to do was kick the door in and it would collapse. Putin had the same view of Ukraine. They were going to be able to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine on the cheap, in a sense. And it was well, they thought, within their capabilities to do so. He was profoundly wrong. It has resulted in enormous adverse strategic consequences from Russia, which I'm happy to discuss. But what the sense I got from Putin's address yesterday, part of it at least, and Jill and I talked about this on a Georgetown podcast yesterday, and I'll credit Jill for the phrase. There's sort of a sense of fortress Russia to this, right? Those business leaders, those oligarchs who've made lots of money and bought their yachts and their townhouses and so forth in the West, Russian business leaders, you got to come back and you've got to invest, and we've got to develop our Russian economy, our Russian industry, our Russian technology. And he said at the outset of the special military operation that Western sanctions and export controls weren't going to cut off Russia from the West, from the global economy. Now he's taking a slightly different tack and saying Russia, for its survival as a great power and a great country, needs to isolate itself from the crazy Satanist West run by these leaders and elites who are sadly misguided, going to hell, religious connotations, references, and so forth. But the two final points, first on the thrust of the speech and one of my reactions to it, and then I want to talk briefly about, at the very conclusion, he discusses New Start. My sense in reading the speech was, for anybody who wondered whether there was an opportunity to negotiate with Russia an end to this war, I think Putin's speech gives a pretty emphatic answer to that. I mean, he is all in. He says, this is his messianic mission, and he's had this defeat. I mean, these are difficult times, and I kept thinking of. I have this memory of back in February of '43. And Putin loves drawing historical references, particularly to the Great Patriotic War. Goebbels, in February of '43, gives a famous speech after Germany has lost the Battle of Stalingrad. Relevant now, right? Because Putin gave an address most recently on the 80th anniversary of that battle. What was Goebbels' reaction? Goebbels gives a speech that's known as the Totaler Krieg speech, total war. This was going to be a mobilization of the German people, the German Volk, and they were going to resist the Bolshevik horde that was coming from the East. It was total war. I get that sense from reading. I mean, it's what I think Jill was getting at with Fortress Russia. This is total war against the West. And why do I say that? What's here in this speech that gives me that sense? Here's where he says in the middle of the speech, he's talking about economic development, business, technology, and so forth, but it's all got to be aimed at victory in this war. So he says the successful launch of Russian companies and small family businesses is a victory. A victory in what? A victory in this titanic struggle against the West. The opening of modern factories and new roads is a victory. A new school or kindergarten is a victory. Scientific discoveries and technology is a victory. Everybody's contribution to the overall success of this struggle is a victory. The only thing that's missing at the end is a Sieg Heil. Hail victory. This is total war in his mind. He is all in. There is no negotiation. There is no compromise. The only thing is victory. It's what Goebbels said in 1943, and it didn't work out well for the Third Reich. Putin is all in with this, and that's what this speech tells me.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Sullivan. We're going to turn to Will Pomeranz. And Will, I know this is a really, again, a broad thing. This is a great way of getting into it by quoting President Putin himself. And, the purpose, we're here to talk about causes and consequences. And I'd love to see your framing of how, what was the cause? What are the causes? And now the consequences. So, Will, you're on.
Well, in terms of the causes of this war, there are many, but I think Vladimir Putin telegraphed what the aspirations and objectives of this war are in his 2020 constitutional amendments. And in these constitutional amendments, he said that Russia could not give away any of its territory, and further, he emphasized that the Russian Federation had an obligation to defend ethnic Russians abroad. And I think that these two principles have been guiding Putin during this war. Quite frankly, if he wants to ignore the Constitution, he can, and he has done so in various stages of his career. But nevertheless, one of the first things that Putin did after the invasion was to make sure that the 4 new regions were put in the Russian Constitution. And I think this has tremendous consequences for Putin and how he wants to conduct and how he can get out of this war. Because basically, by putting them in the Constitution and saying that these are Russian territories, even if they don't actually control all these territories, including Kherson, the ability of Putin to leave these territories, to kind of declare victory and go home, is very difficult for him because he's put them in the Constitution. And that would allow for defeat. And Putin is, as Ambassador Sullivan said, is not really contemplating any sort of defeat in this war. So I think that one of the important things that we need to mention and emphasize is that this is a war of imperial and territorial aggression. And because that Putin has now annexed these territories and put them in the Constitution, he has a lot more difficulties in trying to say that, we can declare victory and go home. The other important things about this war for Putin is the acquisition of land, because the conquest of territory is what cements a great leader in Russia. And that is what Putin emphasized in the aftermath of the conquest of Crimea. And he said that on various occasions as well. For example, Putin has criticized Vladimir Lenin many times because he surrendered Russian territory. And he has said, we surrendered in World War I, that we lost to the losing party, a unique case in history. And for a similar reason, I think Putin doesn't have any respect, or didn't have any respect, for Mikhail Gorbachev. And he clearly didn't have time to go to the funeral. And that is because, I think, Gorbachev also lost territory. And this is an important aspect of Putin's ideals and what he perceives as greatness. So I think what we're witnessing is not only a war of attrition, but an imperial war based on territorial acquisition. In terms of imperial restoration, I think the signs are everywhere. In terms of defending the purity of the Russian language, as well as designating the Russian language as the language of the state-building people. There is a new course that is being prepared at Russian universities to teach young people about the foundations of Russian statehood. The Russian state has always been the dominant administrative, law-creating, and unifying body for over 300 years in Russian history, as well as the backbone of the Russian Empire. And it's not surprising the themes that they want to stress in this course, and they include talking about Russia's special path, Russian patriotism, Russia as a separate civilization, the importance of community over individualism, and national unity. What this course will definitely not assert is that Russia is one of several national states in the Russian Federation, as occurred during the Yeltsin era, and you can think about Tatarstan and other republics, ethnic republics that Yeltsin created. Whether young people want to actually attend this course, it doesn't appear to be of concern to its organizers. They want to make sure that a new generation is exposed to the principles of Russian statehood, and as articulated by the head of the Duma Committee on State Construction, Pavel Krashenikov, the driving force behind empire is territorial expansion, and that has been confirmed during this war. There are other kind of acts of restoration that I can deal with, including the return of the State Council, which was an institution that was created by Alexander I, and it is an attempt basically to go around the legislature and to kind of create a consensus amongst all the political actors, except that the State Council really has not had a real mission to pursue. One of the assigned responsibilities is to administer the new unified system of public power, which was also included in the Russian Constitution in 2020. No one knows what that means, but it is apparent that that principle would contradict one of the important principles of the original 1993 Constitution, namely the independence of local self-government. So I think, where does that leave Putin's 21st century imperial dream? I think it's mostly Russia is now on the outside looking in. I think that was what Ambassador Sullivan emphasized. There's a long list of institutions that Russia is no longer a member of, including the European Court of Human Rights, the Council of Europe. I can go on and on. But Russia has basically decided to isolate itself from the global economy. The United States and the EU have taken away permanent normal trade relations with Russia, which will make any sort of attempt to have Russia return to the global community, economic community, it will make it very difficult. Finally, I think the last thing I'll want to say, and this goes back to history and World War II, is I think that one of the primary consequences of this war is that Russia no longer can use its victory in World War II as a source of unity. And that primarily was the major source of unity throughout the Soviet and post-Soviet era. But now, because of the crimes that have been committed in Ukraine, Russia can't really say that the war of annexation is part of a effort to really engage in the global rules-based order. Therefore, I think what is the last statement that I want to make is that even if the war ended tomorrow and Putin somehow disappeared, the war would not be over, because in addition to securing peace and returning territory, the question of Russian war crimes and accountability for waging an unprovoked and aggressive war must be dealt with as well, and that it will take a long time and is most uncertain under what international principles and international law that will be pursued. And with that, I'll turn it over to Olena.
Thank you. And Olena, Dr. Lennon, I just wanted to kind of maybe frame a question. A little more specifically, Will was just talking about the crimes, and you could list those under, I think, the consequences of this war. I'd be very interested, not only theoretically, because you look at it that way, but also on the ground, the effect of the war crimes that have been carried out on the territory of Ukraine. So please.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. And thank you, the Wilson Center, for hosting this event. Thank you so much for coming. Will, Ambassador Sullivan, thank you for your comments. So first of all, thank you for being here. This is one of many events going on this week. It's an important milestone, but I think it's really important to pause and reflect on the last year. For me personally, the war started in 2014. My hometown was one of the first towns occupied in the Donetsk Oblast and remains occupied. So at that time, we thought that this was going to be over soon. At that, we didn't really realize it was going to last this long. But then with the Minsk agreements, it became increasingly clear that Ukraine and Russia have irreconcilable differences. And even though the line was frozen for a while, those differences did not go away. And I think we anticipated that this was going to result in a large-scale offensive of some sort. So, but that kind of brings me to what I wanted to spend most of my time talking about, is how the last year has made Ukraine the largest war crime scene since World War II. It's the largest humanitarian crisis since World War II, the largest refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. So it is of historic proportions, and we're only at year one. Now that I'm pessimistic about the prospects of a resolution, only because I know that we've been at it for 9 years now with the frozen conflict, and I think unfortunately it might be a protracted war. So the liberation of Kyiv, as you know, Kharkiv and Kherson Oblast revealed egregious war crimes on unprecedented proportions. So much so, in fact, that so many European countries, the United Nations, OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, including multiple domestic Ukrainian investigative teams, have descended on those in areas as those villages were liberated to collect, preserve, document war crimes. And right now, it is truly a multinational effort. So the United Nations Independent International Commission last October issued a report that concluded that war crimes ranged from summary executions, unlawful confinement, torture, rape, forceful deportation of children, and indiscriminate shelling of civilian infrastructure and residential areas. So I'm not a lawyer, and I come at this from the point of view of how this multinational effort and multinational engagement in holding perpetrators accountable and helping Ukraine with rendering justice on perpetrators has been reshaping not just Ukraine's domestic and foreign policy, but also the international justice system writ large and international relations. The other source of point of reference that I wanted to emphasize is Yale School of Public Health has just recently released a report that documented several re-education camps and adoption camps on Russia-held territories that have been trafficking children, orphaned children from occupied territories. So the conservative estimate right now is that about 6,000 children have been transferred, Ukrainian children have been transferred to Russia, and that is genocide, basically. Many international experts have looked at the situation and assessed that we are, in fact, dealing with genocidal practices. So, on the one hand, it's remarkable that the so-called international community is paying attention and obviously helping Ukraine deal with, these sort of massive atrocities on a scale unknown before. But on the other hand, there is a lack of coordination. The Prosecutor General's office in Kyiv, in Ukraine, currently has 67,000 cases in the Prosecutor General's desk, and they keep growing. So, it's obviously Ukraine, the multiple teams, investigative teams and forensic teams that have flooded Ukraine They are not only to help Ukraine relieve the burden of these investigations and prosecutions, but also to make sure that these investigations are impartial, because the war is still ongoing, and obviously, there's concern too that there might be some, arbitrary decisions there. But we could be, there's a tremendous amount of effort to prosecute war crimes and collect and document war crimes. But there's a caveat to that. The International Criminal Court and Ukrainian judicial system currently are the only two institutions that have jurisdiction over war crimes. The ICC in particular has jurisdiction over three types of crimes: war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Now, that leaves out the most important crime, international crime, and that is the mother of all crimes, crime of aggression, that actually holds leaders, the decision makers, accountable. And that's the missing piece. Currently, there is no international mechanism to prosecute crimes of aggression, unless these countries, the aggressor itself, is party to ICC, which we know that Russia is not party to ICC. Now, Ukraine accepted ICC. Ukraine is not party to ICC either. But in 2014, Ukraine accepted the ICC's jurisdiction on its territory, which pretty much obligates Ukraine to cooperate with ICC. And that also reminds me that as we talk about war crimes, it's important to keep in mind that the International Criminal Court has been active in Ukraine since 2013, since November 2013. So Ukraine actually invited the ICC and accepted the jurisdiction and full cooperation with the court as early as 2013, because already, particularly in where I'm from, several torture camps were set up back in 2014. So these war crimes have been documented. And unfortunately, it took a tragedy of this scale. It took a large-scale invasion and just the quantitative difference and the scale and scope of war crimes and crimes against humanity to actually bring those old crimes back in focus. Keep in mind, too, that this has been going on for 9 years, and the international community only now is being actively engaged. Because right now it's so blatant and it's so in your face that we just cannot ignore it. But the system is designed to ignore it. And that's kind of where I'm going with my comments, is that there is no international mechanism that would hold perpetrators accountable, that would hold leaders, and that's how crime of aggression is defined. It's people who it targets people who planned, prepared, initiated, and executed orders that led to war crimes. So it's the mother of all crimes that made it all possible. So how can we sort of mitigate that situation? So Zelensky made it clear that, and he speaks on behalf of Ukrainians, that there is no peace without justice. In fact, last year, Zelensky came up with 10 points, the 10-point plan on sort of peace plan that would, consisting of different action items that would need to take place before any possibility of a peace agreement or resolution is even discussed. And one of them is justice. Victims require justice. Any sort of post-conflict rebuilding or any negotiations would have to address prosecution of war crimes. So justice is important, and this is one of the imperatives that the United States, NATO allies, EU leaders have to also incorporate in several different packages of assistance: military, humanitarian, social, judicial assistance, and assisting Ukraine with documenting and prosecuting crimes is absolutely an imperative alongside many others. So why is this? You could say that war crimes don't expire, right? So there is no that it takes years, but perpetrators can be brought to justice eventually. And the problem with in the case of Ukraine is that yes, we have eventually justice will be served, but it is an active war zone. witnesses disappear, people get killed, evidence is destroyed, and war crimes continue piling up. So this is not a done deal. So what the U.S. has done so far, recognizing the magnitude of the situation, is that they've allocated financial resources to Ukraine to help build capacity in its judicial institutions. They have also increased their cooperation with the ICC. But it's a Band-Aid solution, because ultimately what's missing is that the inability, there's no mechanism to prosecute the leaders in the Kremlin. Ukraine can get bogged down in prosecuting every single soldier, and right now there's 67,000 cases. But that's a tremendous burden on an already overwhelmed system that also deals with cases of collaborationism and corruption. There are a lot of needs. And on top of that, there's prosecution of war crimes. So there's two ways, there are two conversations going on right now as far as how we can actually hold leaders in the Kremlin accountable. So the first option is relying on domestic prosecution, because Ukraine actually, by Ukrainian law, aggression is a crime, and they could technically prosecute leaders in the Kremlin. However, there are two kind of limitations to that. Number one is that international law establishes immunity. Immunity for foreign leaders, heads of states, prime ministers of foreign affairs. So they have immunity from being prosecuted in domestic courts of foreign states, and that's of course intentional, because if if the immunity was lifted, then many heads of states around the world would be facing prosecution. Now, and that's one limitation. However, the Ukrainian judicial system did actually prosecute one person for a crime of aggression, and that's Viktor Yanukovych, the former president of Ukraine, because he's a Ukrainian citizen. Even though he's in exile in Russia, because he's a Ukrainian citizen, they actually sentenced him to 16 years in prison, I believe, by absentia, basically. And the second limitation is that Ukraine allows, if we were to rely on domestic courts, Ukraine allows trial in absentia, but it's typically against international practices, because the international law frowns upon trying people in absentia, because that's against human rights. So the conversation now is how do we create a special tribunal to render justice? There are two ways. One could be a constellation of allies creating kind of self-appointing to be a part of this court. The EU now stepped up to be the leader of that effort. And the other option is to have the United Nations authorize a special tribunal that would prosecute leaders in the Kremlin for crimes of aggression. Both have advantages and disadvantages. In the interest of time, all I can say is that so there's this debate in the international community, in the General Assembly, as far as how exactly to set up this court, the special tribunal, the same way war crimes were prosecuted in Rwanda, Cambodia, the former Yugoslavia, Chad, and many other places. They were all, in each instance, there were special tribunals configured in different ways. So in the case of Ukraine, where I would end to wrap this up is that so it's not just about creating a special tribunal and how it's configured, or amending the Rome Statute that would allow prosecution of crime of aggression regardless if countries are party or parties to the ICC, as long as the country that is being attacked, that on which territory these crimes take place, as long as they authorize this prosecution, that is the only green light needed. Now, the Rome Statute could be amended to include that definition of crime of aggression as applicable in every instance, but that would take years. In my opinion, to wrap this up, both are needed. So we need short-term solutions, so they're not mutually exclusive, while we're figuring out a way of setting up this special tribunal. At the same time, the international community, so to speak, should also be thinking of creating a universal mechanism, not only to punish war crimes that are happening in Ukraine right now, but also to prevent crimes of aggression in the future, to make aggression prohibitively costly on the aggressors. And because this is the opportunity that I think like no other, that a lot of nations that have suffered from genocide and war crimes, particularly at the Russian hands, have been waiting for. And just a personal anecdote. And Jill and I were having this conversation earlier. How many times, when I engage in these conversations, people from Georgia come up to me, the Baltics, Syria, and where they say, when they look at what's going on in Ukraine and say they feel as though this is also their moment in history when they feel as though finally Russia, the leaders in the Kremlin, can be held accountable for war crimes that they committed in their countries too, yet justice has never been rendered. So people need closure. And people need justice, and it must be an essential component of any reconstruction and rebuilding efforts. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lennon. Well, this is good. We're already getting some good questions, and just a reminder, 3 ways to ask a question if you want. Email at Kennan@wilsoncenter.org, Twitter @Kennan Institute, or on our Facebook page. And please identify yourself when you do. I'm thinking, just looking here at the clock, since that's my job, that I would sprinkle questions from the audience with one question that I do have specifically for Ambassador Sullivan. I think I'll take the liberty of quickly asking, and maybe we'll keep these comments a little bit shorter so we can get in a lot of questions. But, when we're talking about consequences, Ambassador Sullivan, for many years, or at least during the Cold War, we had containment. Containment was kind of the paradigm of dealing with Russia. Now, if you have a state which has invaded another state in Europe and is, the way you have described it, a fortress Russia that is not going to step back, that has violated laws, et cetera. What is the paradigm now? I mean, how does the West, and this is kind of a similar question to one that has been asked, how does the West deal with this? Is it possible at this point to even have a paradigm, or do we have to wait to see how this develops?
Well, it's something I've thought a lot about. Of course, the containment strategy that you mentioned, Jill, was containment of the Soviet Union, which was also animated by an ideology, communism. We've got a different situation here with the Russian Federation, and as Will has correctly pointed out, with imperial ambitions as opposed to an ideology that sought global domination by a communist model. I think the key is I think of Ronald Reagan. He used to infuriate Gorbachev by repeating in English the Russian phrase "trust but verify." Now, almost 40 years later, there's no trust. There's only verification. We can call it verification, containment. There's no trust. Would you trust Vladimir Putin? Would you trust Sergei Lavrov? They told us days before the invasion they not only weren't going to do it, they didn't even have plans to do it. They lied to the world. How can anybody trust that government? So it's a huge challenge, particularly for a country that has, and if I may, I work in just a brief point on New Start. I forgot to mention it. Constraining a country that has those imperial ambitions backed by the largest stockpile of nuclear weapons in the world. The New Start Treaty from which President Putin announced Russia is suspending its participation in, limits strategic nuclear weapons and delivery systems. But Russia has developed the largest stockpile of non-strategic nuclear weapons in the world. In fact, they decline there's no transparency to say how many non-strategic nuclear weapons they have, despite repeated requests from the United States. On New START, what President Putin did, pardon me for, this is an addendum to my opening remarks, but it's important. Putin tacks on at the end of his remarks a paragraph or two on New START. And there's both more and less than meets the eye in what he said. There's less than meets the eye because the Russians have already effectively suspended their participation in the New START treaty. The United States has sought for months and months to get inspections, which is something that we are entitled to under the treaty, both sides. It's not something that the Russians can decide whether or not to grant us. We have a right under the treaty to inspect, as do the Russians. And the Russian government, in fact, Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov has said months ago, I think it's months ago now, we're not going to allow inspections. And citing basically the rationale that Putin did, the United States is so hostile to Russia now, at war with Russia, we're not going to do it. The Russians also don't participate in the so-called Bilateral Consultative Commission, which is the treaty body in which both Russia and the United States consult on treaty issues. So the Russians had already suspended participation in the treaty. But there's more to it than that, because this is the president of the Russian Federation saying it. He also introduces new concepts which are foreign to this treaty between the United States and Russia, which is the nuclear weapons that France and Great Britain have. The Russians reacted vehemently years ago when the United States started to discuss the nuclear weapons that China has. And when I would raise the prospect of trying to get the Chinese involved in a trilateral discussion of arms control, the Russians would say, it's extraneous. This is a treaty, New START, between the United States and Russia. Don't introduce a third country. And oh, by the way, if you do, we will introduce an extraneous matter, which is the nuclear weapons held by your two NATO allies on the Security Council. So now Putin says, we'll only go back into, and participate in the New START treaty if we consider what the French and the British have. So he's really going a step further than suspending participation in the treaty. But the most important point is, and commentators, particularly pro-Kremlin commentators, after the speech, congratulated Putin on a more sophisticated and elegant way of nuclear blackmail. Oh, by the way, we've got this destructive war in Ukraine that you're waging against us. Let me just remind you, United States, that I can suspend participation in the New START treaty. I can grow my nuclear, including strategic nuclear weapons, stockpile, but doing it in a way that doesn't offend President Xi, Prime Minister Modi, isn't a more aggressive form of nuclear blackmail, but in effect, that's what it is.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think we'll jump into some of the questions. And there is one, it's from Bill Hill, actually a colleague, global fellow on the Kennan Advisory Council. And he says, Putin has purposefully made it harder or impossible for Moscow to walk back its action. We've already talked about that. Given such commitment and mentality on the part of Putin and presumably his colleagues, how do you see this conflict evolving and ending? Is there any path to an acceptable resolution of the war besides a protracted military effort and Russian military defeat? Will, do you want to jump in here?
Well, I think Ambassador Hill has kind of outlined where things stand right now in the question. There is no room for negotiation, as I've talked about. Russia has not really kind of exposed itself to a willingness to negotiate. And I think for Putin and for Zelensky, losing is not an option. So I don't think that there is a strong push for negotiations. I think there would have to be a change in the battlefield, that one side will be clearly losing, and that would force them to negotiate. But until that time occurs, I don't think that there is a global consensus as to how this conflict can end, and who would actually negotiate acceptable compromise for Russia and Ukraine. I don't see that in the cards at all at the present time.
A question, and perhaps Dr. Lennon, you can take this, because you kind of mentioned other countries in the region. This is from Howard Matson, who's from the Circumnavigators Club. Looking forward, are there things the governments of the Baltic countries and Moldova should be doing now in possible preparation in light of current events? I presume meaning if they could be invaded.
Right, and those are the countries that are taking it most seriously, because they do recognize the risk. Obviously there's only so much they could do after years of divesting from their defense spending. So I think what the reality that everybody's looking at right now is that we're seeing an increase in defense spending all across Europe, particularly in the Baltics. But along those lines too, and kind of to piggyback off of Will's response, one reason why this will be a protracted war, and obviously neighboring countries will need to be concerned, and that presents a threat to them as well, is that there are two things that both Ukraine and Russia believe in. One is that victory is possible, and two is that defeat is unacceptable. So good luck to all of us, particularly the neighboring countries. And I think where the military effort will be in the foreseeable future and midterm perspective too, is that right now the battlefield dynamics are a way to strengthen negotiating positions. So as we're paying attention to incremental gains and losses, what this is about, obviously it is about the control of strategic transportation hubs, Bakhmut and so on. But at the same time, what the military effort is doing essentially is Ukraine and Russia both changing their future negotiating positions that in some long-term perspective will need to happen. But hence, the military escalation that we see and the really war of attrition that is unfolding. So, kind of bringing back to the region, without a doubt, this is going to affect the entire security architecture. And I think where particularly the Baltics and Eastern European countries will lead is in creating a new form of security guarantees, that as some new constellation of forces, and I think it must be led by the United States, that will kind of figure out some new way of long-term security guarantees for Ukraine. And I think the Baltics will be leading that effort as well.
Mm-hmm. There's a question here, and I see one in the audience noted, another one too. But there is a question here, and I think this is for Ambassador Sullivan, that kind of combines causes and consequences. Number one, it's about NATO. And the question is from Errol Henderson, who is from the Department of Political Science, Penn State University. And he says, please discuss the relationship between NATO expansion and Putin's arguments on initiating the war in Ukraine. And of course, we all know that. But I'm interested, that's kind of the cause. But the consequence has been Finland and Sweden about to join NATO. So could you take that, Ambassador?
Yeah, sure. Well, on that final point, Jill, President Biden mentioned that last night in Warsaw. I mean, among the strategic catastrophes from Putin's perspective as a result of the special military operation is that Sweden and Finland have sought to join NATO. We hope that will happen at the next NATO Leaders Summit. We've got issues that still need to be worked out, particularly between Sweden and Turkey. But imagine how the expansion, for example, of Russia's border with NATO has expanded quite a great deal. But, on NATO expansion, the argument that not just President Putin but other Russian government officials, Russian nationalists make is that they view NATO as, in effect, a military steamroller. It's sort of like the opposite of the Red Army, the steamroller moving west from Russia to crush Germany. They view NATO as a steamroller moving east. What they don't take account of, and this is key in my opinion, including in the Russian aggression against Ukraine, and that is the views of the people in Eastern Europe. They're the ones who sought to join NATO. It was the people of Ukraine, the people of, and we talk about, if we go back to the 90s, the people of the Baltics, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Czechia, and Slovakia, etc. The threat they felt, their experiences, both during the Great Patriotic War and subsequently under the Soviet Union, and the persistent threat they saw from Russia after the Cold War, is what drove them west. It was not so much NATO moving east, it was the Eastern Europeans moving west, because the colossus on their border that remained, the Russian Federation, and the threat they felt from Russia. And Russia acknowledges, the Russian government, President Putin, does not acknowledge that any country, any citizens of Eastern Europe have any agency over their own national security. The Russians always talk about indivisible security, which is a phrase that is littered throughout legal documents, treaties, etc., over the last several decades. What that means is, if one country in Europe is insecure, then all of Europe is insecure. And from the Russian perspective, there's only one country that matters. If Russia's insecure, then all of Europe is insecure. If Ukraine's insecure, tough. Those are our historic lands. The Baltics are insecure, who cares? Poland's insecure, who cares? That attitude is what drove the Eastern Europeans west to Brussels. And that's something that is not contemplated, could even be uttered in Russia. It's unthinkable.
There's a question from Anita Parlow, who's from A.L. Parlow and Associates, LLC, and she asks about the consequences for Russia, the West, and China moving forward. That's a very broad question, but let's take China, because today in Moscow, we have the top foreign policy advisor to Chinese President Xi, who is in Moscow, I believe, about to meet, or maybe has, President Putin. His name is Wang Yi. And so that really raises this very big question of China. I'm tempted to take Ambassador Sullivan. Is that the consensus? Can we get back? I know you're talking a lot. Don't want to exhaust you here. Will? Maybe Will. Do you want to handle that? Or
I think Professor Pomeranz.
Yeah.
Well, I think clearly we have warned China now not to be engaged and to give significant amount of material assistance and military assistance to Russia. And I think Blinken's message at the Munich Security Council conference was pretty straightforward, that there would be consequences for China if they actually became a part and engaged in this war, and basically a supplier, not only in terms of weapons, but in terms of economics as well, for Russia. That China represents a potential real black hole in the sanctions and the isolation of Russia. So I think that is very much a concern. We're still waiting to see what the reaction of China was. We're still waiting to see what this phrase "no limits" means in reality. Clearly, the consensus is that China has basically followed the U.S. sanctions and doesn't want to get involved in participating in sanctioned entities. But whether that is a change of policy going forward, and China decides that for whatever reasons, from an economic standpoint, just as a sense of trying to keep the West engaged, if they decide that they want to pursue a greater input for Russia and greater trade and access to military equipment for Russia, then we have a different set of facts going forward, and I think a more dangerous set of facts.
Sir, I'd like to have you ask a question, but technically, is there a microphone? Oh, excellent. Okay. Yes, sir. And if you could identify yourself, please.
Hello, my name is David Baxter, and I'm from the International Sustainable Resilience Center. I have a question, a broad question for the panel. The last year has proven that in so many ways we have been wrong in our ability to predict anything about the Ukraine and Russia's intentions. Even Zelensky, a few days before the invasion, said the Russians would never invade. And this has led to everyone becoming reactive to unexpected events instead of proactive. And I'm wondering what can be done that countries can recalibrate their strategies and their policies to be more reactive, and instead of being behind the curve, can actually be in front of it, so that we can catch up and not be basically reactive all the time.
Is there a person you'd like to ask specifically, or
just the panel in general?
Okay. Is there somebody who would like to take that, or shall I choose? Elena?
I can start. And that's something that I talk about all the time in terms of how misunderstood or poorly understood Ukraine is as a nation, Ukrainian history. And I think there's got to be a deeper emphasis on Ukrainian studies as in the United States in particular. I think the United States is superior in terms of collecting information and collecting intelligence. We have, unmatched intelligence collecting capabilities, but what we're not as good at, and I speak on behalf of, as an American, we're not as good at is analyzing that information, selecting what's relevant, and contextualizing that information. So I think the world, writ large was really surprised. Some people were not as surprised, just how strong Ukrainian unity and then sort of sense of nationalism and national identity is. But at the same time, I would say that, I don't know if we should be as focused on predictive models. I think that one of the things that I think the United States has done pretty well is responding quickly to the situation, being adaptive, and responding to realities on the battlefield, and general geostrategic dynamics. But beyond that, I think that I would kind of end on this note, is that we should really listen to the people, whether it's Ukraine or Georgia or Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, really listen to what what they're saying in terms of what threatens them, and validate them in those perceptions, in their assessment, because they know better. They know Russia better, they know themselves better, they know their region better. So it is, we should be taking their lead in terms of, assessing, putting the right indicators on where the risk is coming from, and really validating those minority views, so to speak.
Ambassador Sullivan, I have another one for you. This is from Dr. Ann Phillips, Fellow, Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University. And she says, when Putin first came into office, he promoted a common European home and partnership with the West. Since then, he has adopted a more confrontational position with the West. Can any of the panelists speak about what led Putin to change from a position of cooperation to confrontation?
For me?
Yes, sir.
Well, I agree with the premise that when he first came into office, first as prime minister and then as president, he was certainly more open to integrating into the West. He now complains about that, laments that in his speech yesterday, but it was certainly the case 23 years ago that he was more open to it. I remember back in the George W. Bush administration, I was the Deputy Secretary of Commerce, meeting with Russian government officials in the first decade of this century, and the optimism that both sides had for Russia's integration into the Western, particularly economic system. But what lurked beneath the surface for President Putin was what has been what is attributed to him as his statement that the great catastrophe of the 20th century was the demise of the Soviet Union. And what I interpret him as saying is that he's not lamenting the demise of communism, of the communist system. What he does lament is that the demise of the Soviet Union meant that international borders sprung up on what had been borders within the Soviet Union that Moscow didn't have to treat as international borders for purposes of the UN Charter, for example, but that those now international borders with Ukraine, Belarus, etc., separated the Russian people, his people, and that's what he's seeking to overcome. He wants to regather the Russian people, their historic lands, his people, and that's what lurks beneath all that he's been doing for decades since he was Lieutenant Colonel Putin in the KGB in Dresden and saw the demise of the Soviet Union from that post. And there's a famous story that he recounts and has been recounted of as the wall came down and as groups gathered outside the KGB headquarters in Dresden, he calls the center, he calls Moscow for instruction, and no one picks up the phone. And they were left to their own devices. And that's what his view is for the Russian people who are now on the wrong side of this phony border, in his opinion, with Ukraine. Those Russians, those are the people that he wants to regather. And when he says in his first paragraph of his speech yesterday, he engaged in a special military operation for protecting people in our historic lands. Those are the Russians that are now on the wrong side of that border. That border exists because of the demise of the Soviet Union, and that's the catastrophe that he is seeking to undo. And it is inconsistent with his desire to integrate with the West, but it trumps everything. It's the most important thing from his perspective.
You know, you and I have talked about this previously, but there's kind of this new wrinkle as well. I'll just jump in here, where Putin says, the West never wanted us anyway. They were lying that they wanted us. They actually hate us. They don't want us. Could you just, like, a couple of seconds on that? Because I think it's a kind of a new theme, and it seems effective because what it says to Russians is, don't even think about integrating with Europe because they don't want you.
It shot through his remarks yesterday. He talks about those wealthy Russians who bought their yachts and their townhouses in the West, and what they didn't realize, according to Putin, was that they are second-class citizens here, that there is just rampant Russophobia, anti-Russian attitudes throughout the West among, his phrase, the elites in the West, that Russians will never be accepted. And, that is part of his effort to unify, to create this fortress Russia. The world's against us.
Will, did you?
Yeah, I just think this whole question of integration and the 1990s and so forth and what was actually proposed to Russia. I don't think the West or the United States proposed a Marshall Plan. I don't think that the United States proposed to bail out Soviet industry because we didn't understand Soviet industry. We couldn't have done it in terms of economics. But we did say that over time we would integrate Russia in the global economy. And I think in light of all the economic problems that have occurred in the aftermath of sanctions and so forth, that we actually lived up to that promise, that we did integrate to an extent the Russian economy into the West, and the inability and the failure of the 1990s is that we didn't create those institutions that would allow Russia to continue that integration. And so what happened I don't think it's the West's fault, as it were, that somehow Russia has not integrated. I worked in law firms and with businesses who were investing in Russia during the 1990s and the 2000s. And they were, as Ambassador Sullivan said, they were optimistic. They would have to be optimistic if they were going to invest some money in the Russian Federation. So I think Putin has changed his tune. And I think what is readily evident is not only does Putin have a suspicion against the West, but he doesn't understand the West. And especially he doesn't understand global economics, because the idea of fortress Russia, of somehow import substitution, all the other types of things that Russia is contemplating, parallel imports, et cetera, it is quite clear that Putin does not understand the ramifications of going it alone in fortress Russia.
Okay. We have a question from the audience right here. Sir, if you could identify yourself.
David Sobelson, I'm a freelance scholar in Washington, D.C. I would like to know how the panel thinks the West will respond when a desperate Vladimir Putin uses chemical weapons in the Ukraine, and why, after I've asked this question at numerous panels, no one really wants to answer this question. Is it possible that Putin is nuclear saber-rattling so that we don't react as strongly when he uses chemical weapons? And what about the Assad precedent? How did the West respond when Assad used chemical weapons in Syria with the help of Russia?
Okay. Dr. Lennon, would you like to try that one?
Well, nuclear deterrence. It really is the name of the game here. I think and I hate to give a cop-out answer, but I think the Biden administration is practicing strategic ambiguity here. They're for a reason they're not disclosing exactly how they're going to respond, but I think they sent a pretty strong message to Russia, through back channels, that the response is going to be proportional and that it is going to have catastrophic results. I don't know how exactly they will respond. The Russian military doctrine presupposes the use of tactical nuclear weapons in various scenarios, but if you look at each of those scenarios, none of them benefit Russia. So it's unclear if Russia will necessarily benefit from deploying a tactical nuclear weapon somewhere in Ukraine for demonstrative purposes or to augment their conventional forces. It would not be of benefit. It's just unclear how that would necessarily benefit Russia, and if they're equipped to even handle chemical warfare. I mean, their troops are so poorly equipped and trained that maybe a year ago this would have been a plausible scenario. But at this point, with the Russian military being so depleted and so degraded, I think they must know that they will not be able to handle chemical warfare in any way that would give Russia, an advantage. So I think that the U.S. estimates that the chances of Russia using nuclear weapons are still low, that even though the Russian military has suffered tremendously on the ground, there hasn't been any significant existential threat to the Putin regime itself. That even if Russia lost the war, I think Putin's regime would still be legitimate in Russia. And right now, it's not facing an existential threat. And I think there's still that sort of room for maneuver there to where it's still not at that level of existential threat to Russia that they would even consider that. But I think nuclear saber-rattling will definitely continue. And we have been responding. I think the U.S. has has responded adequately and proportionally to those threats without disclosing too much.
Ambassador Sullivan, do you have anything to add to that? You've dealt directly, obviously, with this issue.
Yeah, I think it's a realistic scenario. I wondered whether they were going to use, as the Assad regime did, chemical weapons, barrel bombs, when they were trying to reduce the Azovstal works, last year. It wouldn't surprise me if they used chemical weapons in a limited setting like that. But my prediction would be, just as they've done with Syria, they would try to do it in a way that they would blame the Ukrainians. This is actually a provocation by the Ukrainians, and what they would count on would be the United States and our allies and partners taking the matter to the OPCW for getting wrapped around the axle of an investigation of who did what, which is going to be impossible in a war zone. That strikes me as a distinct possibility. I thought we might have seen it last year in Mariupol. There have been accusations, by the way, by the Russians that the Ukrainians have used on a small scale chemical weapons. In fact, I saw in today's, I think it was in the New York Times, an accusation that the Ukrainians are dropping from drones small scale explosives that have chemical elements in them. They make the accusation against the West and against Ukraine very frequently. They're, of course, accusing us of having developed bioweapons laboratories in Ukraine to use against Russia, complete fabrication. So that's a very real threat. My fear is that it will turn out the way the investigations did and the attribution did with Syria, where everyone knows that Assad dropped the barrel bombs. The United States, in that case, there were 2 military strikes in the Trump administration in 2017 and then in 2018 on an airport where the aircraft took off from in the first case in 2017, and then on chemical weapons labs in Syria. I'm not suggesting that that would happen here in Ukraine, because that's direct U.S. participation against the Russian Federation. What is more likely to happen is a feckless or ineffective OPCW investigation.
There's a kind of an intriguing question from, let's see, Courtney Weigel, Central Asian Team, International Tax and Investment Center. And perhaps, Dr. Pomeranz, you could take this little bit off the beaten track of your specialty, but it's good. What is your take on the role of gray war tactics and Russian disinformation campaigns influencing the West during this war? Because we know it is an information war as well as a military war.
I think the Russians have tried significant attempts of disinformation. We can see that in various sorts of rallies and so forth in the United States, in terms of how they're trying to portray their actions in Ukraine. So I think that this is just another front of this war, one that is very difficult to confront, especially because with so many sources of information and disinformation, there isn't the old-time kind of 3 networks kind of distilling all the information to the public. There's lots of ways this information can get out and cannot be corroborated or even objected to. So I think that Russia has waged a effective disinformation war, probably more effective on its own people than on the West. But clearly the Russians are not gaining access to the information on the battlefield and what is happening in Ukraine. And the hope is at some point that information blockade will end, and that Russians will actually have to understand what sort of actions and military aggression it has engaged in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have another question from the audience right down here in the middle. Microphone is coming. There we go. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
And if you could identify yourself.
My name is Timothy Towell. Perhaps I'm too old to do this because I just turned 89 last month. But I was a Foreign Service officer starting in the Kennedy administration. So my mind goes back too long. And I worked for 20 years in the State Department as a political officer. 2 years in Havana, Cuba. More time with Gorbachev than any American, taking him all around the United States of America. So my mind is in the past, and I plan to live to be 100. And my question is, isn't there less than a modern way, and I love you modern people, isn't there a better way to deal with this Turk, this awful little twerp who gallops around with his shirt off on a horse, a KGB officer of second rate, isn't there a better way to deal with it? By doing what I used to do when I taught Russian history in a boarding school in the East. Because we remember that the great musicians and the great writers in Russia, and even those great people that rode their horses through the lake to try and attack the English, the Europeans 500 years ago, isn't Russia and the Russian people really, underneath Putin, wonderful human beings with the courage and the bravery and the history to kick ass in this century? So while we talk about all this modern stuff, can't we, all of you and all of us, go after the real Russians that are hiding up there in the bushes, talk to them, sing the music about 500 years ago, tell them about their history, and crank them up to kick ass? Can't we do that?
I think that that's the first time we've ever used that expression at a Wilson Center event. But a very quick comment, perhaps. Ambassador, you're an ambassador, Ambassador Sullivan, so I think you can handle that one.
Well, I'm a youngster ambassador. You're in your prime. Are you going to run for president in 2024 at 89? You've hit your prime. I'm not channeling my inner Don Lemon, by the way. Sorry about that. The problem we confront is, and Will mentioned this just now, the disinformation that the Russian people have been subjected to over decades. There is an enormous number of Russians who are willing to believe the worst about the United States, the worst about the West. And some of the language that senior Russian government officials, whether it's President Putin, Peskov, Lavrov, use, which sounds so unbelievable and clunky to Western ears, is actually something that Russians who have been subjected to this disinformation over decades are willing to believe.
Yeah. There is, sure, absolutely, Dr. Lennon.
Thank you for your service and for that question. I mean, this kind of goes back to this ultimate question: is Putin's war, or is this Russia's war, right? And I believe in Putin planned, prepared. He started it. I think it's his fault, but I do believe that it is going to be on all Russians to bear the collective responsibility for this, and that's just the unfortunate reality of it. Despite the fact that it was Putin's project. But I think Russia as a society, political society, and the culture will have to deal with this collectively. And I know people don't like collective responsibility conversations, and it's unjust. I have family in Russia too. We have these conversations all the time, and unfortunately, I hold them accountable too, much like we hold our leaders in the United States accountable. And then when we travel overseas, Americans are representatives of their countries, of their governments. So it is both. It is Putin's problem, but it's also Russia's problem.
Mm-hmm. We have a question in the back. If we can get to that gentleman.
Thank you, Stanislav Bunitsky, fellow at the Kennan Center. So my question is about one of the seeming consequences of the war, which is Russia's seeming turn to the global south and to the Africa, Asia, Latin America region. So, for example, the trope of Russian leadership seem to have resurrected the trope of colonialism and calling the West colonial and presenting themselves as spearheading kind of the anti-colonial, the decolonial struggle. So my question is about the panel's thoughts on the prospects of Russia sort of turning into the spearheading the or reinventing itself as the leader of the global south and the kind of geopolitical and geoeconomic consequences of these efforts.
The old non-aligned world. And Dr. Pomeranz, do you want to answer?
Well, again, the question is, what can Russia offer the the global South and the colonial world in response or in addition to what they can already offer right now? And the answer is not much. They're not going to be able to assist in foreign aid. They're not going to be able to trade economically. I think that Lavrov had his nice tour of Africa where he met with some of the African leaders, but I don't think that Russia persuaded the African leaders that Russia is actually a global leader, and that the African nations should follow Russia in terms of international affairs. So I'm very skeptical in terms of what Russia can offer all these different countries and these regions to change the perception of it. And the one thing that they can't offer really is investment.
I think, did we have one more question in the audience? Yes, sir. Can you bring down the microphone, please?
Thank you very much. I'm Dan Solar. I'm a former military intelligence officer and now work as a consultant in the space industry. One of the questions, just kind of turning to consequences of the war here, as we look at the trajectory of the war right now today, it appears to be headed toward one of many frozen conflicts that we've seen across Eastern Europe, largely due to Russia's involvement in its former states. One of the questions I have, though, is when we look at this, part of this problem is oftentimes attributed to the West in general, and a few countries in NATO and a few countries even here in the United States that are unwilling to more aggressively support Ukraine with arms, munitions, training, things like that. We know there's limitations to that. We've already hearing a lot of that. But I guess the big question I have in here is, if that in fact is the rationale, the reason why there's delay there, then how are we not explaining what are the consequences if Ukraine does not win decisively? I think that's an important part, is if lack of a decisive win, that's going to have other consequences far-ranging for the next century, I think, if we don't actually act now today.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador Sullivan?
Well, your question reminds me of the question that was asked previously about intelligence and, being reactive and catching up. So the one area where I think U.S. intelligence was accurate was predicting the invasion and the scale of it. It was why the only reason I was confident in saying what I said when I was ambassador before the war, and I did a lot of press and I was predicting what was going to happen. I was confident because I was being fed information that said this is going to happen. What we failed to recognize was how effective Ukraine was going to be in resisting from the top on down, from President Zelensky himself embodying the courage and heroism of the Ukrainian people staying in Kyiv when, if you would ask me on February 24th or 25th, I would have said, the best he can hope for is, that he gets put on a plane, brought to Moscow, and is, re-educated and maybe spared his life. The more likely outcome is that he would lose his life. He's still here. He met with President Biden yesterday in Kyiv. I would not have predicted that a year ago. But what's happened is, to get to your point, we've been reactive then because we weren't prepared to be supplying Ukrainian armed forces for a long-term conflict against the Russian Federation over the course of a year, who have been catching up over now months and months and months, subject to what President Biden said at the outset, which was, we're going to support Ukraine in every way we can, but Biden, don't want a war with Russia.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm looking at the clock, unfortunately. We don't really have any more time, and I want to apologize for the people who asked questions and were not able to get them in, but it was some really wonderful questions and a wonderful panel. So I want to thank again Ambassador John Sullivan, Dr. Olena Lennon, and Dr. William Pomeranz. Thank you very much. And closing remarks. Please, thanks again to the Global Europe Program for co-sponsoring this with the Kennan Institute. And you can find all of the Wilson Center's Ukraine coverage in one place at Hindsight Upfront Ukraine page. And thank you very much.